Hi, I'm Persephone, and welcome to the Katabasis podcast. You might have heard this word pronounced Katabasis or Katabasis, but ultimately it is a Greek word for delving down, often used to describe going into the underworld for some reason. For example, when Orpheus goes after Eurydice, when Odysseus goes down to speak to several spirits before he finally heads home to Ithaca, or Perseus with his pursuit of Medusa. This word can also mean going into our shadow end, our darker end of the energetic spectrum. Now, when I say darker, you might think evil, but that's actually coming from a lot of racist ideologies. Darker in this case just means on an end of a spectrum. Light and dark does not always equate to good or evil. In this particular practice, dark often just refers to more earthbound spirits or those darker ends of things that are necessary for balance in the world, such as death. So, this space, this podcast, is meant for those who practice on that darker end of the spectrum with things such as transformation, death, those particular deities, or even just things like winter, where oftentimes it means transformation, can come and talk about their practice. The inspiration for this came honestly from a few different areas, but the main thing was I was in a book club for Jamie Wagner's Hades last year. And I found in my conversations with many of the other participants that they had experienced some type of prejudice from non witches or practitioners, as well as witches and practitioners, for our work with Hades or other death deities. And some of that comes from a general fear of that end of the spectrum or the Christian lens of thinking that Hades is the devil. A lot of us had experienced it. I have myself have several stories of that from friends and family and random people. And I started to feel the need to give a space to those of us in this community to come and talk about our practices on a very personal level, talking about what their practice looks like, what it means to them, the work they do to reach out to others, how healing it can be, among other things. And it'll go into quite a few different things. There's some things might be a little traumatic, so always have trigger warnings on our podcast, just because a lot of the time when you're doing shadow work or you're working with that darker end, you're working through a lot, or you're working with people who are going through a lot, and it can be overwhelming. But that's why I wanted to give this space, to give that stigma a kick in the butt. It's honestly very frustrating for those of us in this work to have that stigma and to not feel seen and heard even by our fellow witches and practitioners just because they work with the light end of the spectrum. No diss to them. We need that. We need the balance. We need diversity in this world. But this is to give us that place. The other piece of it is to give community. I'm a big believer in coming together and working together, especially with something as important as death work. And I wanted there to be sort of a home base for that. And I wanted to use my voice and this platform to promote my fellow darker end of the spectrum people, my other chthonic workers and everything else, because honestly, I want to make some friends too, because it is hard to meet people in this community because a lot of the times we have been vilified. It's harder to talk about. And by the time you finally get to know another witch and you say what you do, unfortunately, judgment can often come in. And it's really unfortunate. It's really sad. And so that was a big piece, was to remove the stigma and build that community, just giving a voice to those of us who do it. Today, I'm going to share my own personal story. Most of the episodes are going to be more interview based with other practitioners. We might also do some special topic episodes. I've already got a few in mind with a few other practitioners who share the same interest in those topics. But today is just going to be me. So I have a weird background with this. Trigger warning, there is some traumatic stuff that will come up. I apologize in advance for those of you who might be a little bit overwhelmed, but I am a therapist by trade, and I tell people if you need to take a break, if this is too much for you, please honor yourself. Do not try to stick with this if you can't, or if you feel like you need to come back later when you're a better headspace, you are more than welcome. Do not ever force yourself to do something that's going to make you uncomfortable. That's not what this space is for. So I was actually born dead. Unfortunately, I was born not breathing. I had to be resuscitated, and I am convinced that's the moment I was apparently going to work with the death deities. Um, I was actually born into a family of mediums and tarot readers and Reiki practitioners. My mother's side of the family is very magical. Even though they identified as Catholic, they did a lot of witchy stuff. And I do have an aunt who identifies as a witch now, which is funny. And I have several cousins and things. Several of my siblings also are practitioners, but we were born into that, and I was definitely no exception. I definitely inherited the mediumship aspect, and I do tarot, and I did those for many years, identifying as Christian, but I was scared all the time. My mother would help like cleanse demons from homes and do investigations and things, and I was raised to be very scared of these things, these darker things. But it's funny because even though I had that aspect, my grandmother really promoted me being into the mythologies. And she gave me my first book on Greek mythology. I was immediately attracted to the Hades and Persephone story for a lot of different reasons. Use your imagination. But I was extremely passionate about that story and the other stories and just feeling connected to them. Honestly, I have a lot of weird psychic abilities. I've been told this, and it's something I had to kind of come into because I had restricted them for so long out of the fear that I was raised with. And one of mine is clairaudience. I can hear a lot of things. And I started to hear and experience two particular entities when I was about 11 or 12 years old. And I didn't understand them at the time, so my little child brain identified them as angels. And they told me I needed to give them their name. They couldn't tell me their name, but I could name them. Was super into astronomy at the time. I wanted to be an astronaut, so I named them for stars. I never told anyone this. This will be important for later. Years go by. I didn't really have much like experiences with the death work at that point. That didn't come until later. And then when I was a young adult, this is a hard topic, my best childhood friend passed in an accident. And that was the first real death in my life, as an adult where I fully understood. And also it was a young person, which, oftentimes is very emotional. And that was my first real experience with death in a way that was personal. I'd seen these other ghosts and spirits and helped with different things and, did tarot and learned Reiki and everything else, but this was very personal and different. And it was then that different things started to happen to me. And I don't really need to get into all of that, but I started to change in many ways. A few years later, I ended up leaving the church over a completely different issue, and I realized, like, I didn't feel like I belonged anywhere. I still identified as Christian at the time, but I felt very lost and didn't really know what to do. I was not raised with my biological father. I'm actually a sperm donor baby. But in 2017, we found him, and he is a practitioner in a closed practice that works with death. And also his patron deity is a trickster. And again, that will be important here in a little bit. But it was kind of interesting that suddenly I had that. My grandmother had passed in this time, and she was my person. My grandmother and I are very, very close. She's one of my main spirit team people now, is always kind of around, but she was very encouraging with my abilities. She never tried to shut me up about them like other members in my family did. She was the one who told me to keep going, that they were gifts and I needed to use them as such. So I met my father and I was married at this point. But by 2019, my marriage was falling apart. And I decided to take a solo trip, and I went to Massachusetts, of all places, one of the more spiritual capitals of the US, like New Orleans. And I found a witch store. Now, I had crystals and tarot cards and things like that, but I never really went into witch stores. I never really participated in it. I was curious. I'd watched all the witchy movies like Hocus Pocus and The Craft, Practical Magic, all of that good stuff. But I never really did anything witchy. I didn't have like wands or anything. And I went in and I told her everything I was going through, told her about my abilities. Like it all just kind of came pouring out of me. And she said, "Come with me." took me into a basement where she stored a bunch of more like very deep witchy things, not just like the kitschy stuff sometimes you sell on the main floor. And she handed me a bag of hawthorn and a really gorgeous rose quartz that I still have to this day. And she told me what she wanted me to do. This little ritual. She's like, when you get home, I want you to do this and see what it brings you. Just give it a try. I was like, at this point, I'll try anything. The moment I get home, I do the ritual. And a couple days later, a friend of mine calls and says, hey, I found out there's this group that's doing a winter solstice ritual, because this was towards the end of the year. And it's witchy, and I'm kind of curious about going. Do you want to go with me? And I said, why the fuck not? Let's go. We also curse on this podcast. So if you're offended by that, sorry, I don't want to tell you. We went, and that day honestly changed everything. The woman who ran it was going to start a witch school. And I said, okay, let's try that too. And everything that happened at that point has led to exactly this moment in a way that is so overwhelming when I really think about it. It's hard to describe. Like, a woman I had witch school with is who introduced me to my current partner, and it's one of the healthiest relationships of any kind I've ever had in my life. And that's led to other things that are beautiful. Witches I met during that have become such good friends. I'm officiating one of their weddings later this year. And that was just kind of the tip of the iceberg. I went through witch school. I really started connecting. I started really having my intuition open up. A lot of the doubts went away. I started really deconstructing from the Christian lens of things and the fear that I had had. Now, that particular witch school was focused more on the light end of the spectrum, which, again, I consider myself a gray witch. I believe in the balance. But I wanted to learn the darker end because for so long that had been vilified for me. And I was like, I'm one of those people. I also have a master's in sociology. I have an MSW and a master's in sociology. And I love to learn about everything. So I found a different witch school run by someone who does more of the darker end of the spectrum. She was a Centum Workday devotee. She worked with some other deities too, but that was her main person. And the friends I made in there taught me a lot. And I started to understand more of my abilities. I started to accept them. And that's when I really started working with more of the darker end of the spectrum deities. And I felt at home. I wasn't scared anymore. I wasn't afraid to sleep. I'm prone to very prophetic dreams, a lot of nightmares, like sort of like dream attacks, as I usually call them. And anything I did never worked. But the moment I started working with them, even though I still have them, they don't scare me. They don't tear me down for a whole day. I am able to handle it so much better, and I'm able to protect myself more to where it's just not as detrimental. That in and of itself was worth it to me. But the biggest thing is one of them said, I think the two spirits you've talked to, which I didn't give a lot of detail. I was very protective of that up until this point. And she's like, I think you need to find out more about these abilities. And she's like, there is, a few people who I can recommend. I was like, I kind of want to find my own just because I want to make sure it's clean. I didn't want interference in reading. So I ended up finding someone who did readings on your ancestors' guides, things of that nature. And it's psychic and tarot based. There's a combo. Never really met her before. And I was in my bedroom with the door shut with one of my cats. My now ex-husband was in the basement with our other cat. Again, important for later. And she starts doing the reading. And at first she brings up my grandmother. And she actually knew quite a bit of very specific stuff. Like stuff that I'm like, okay, as someone who does tarot and, cold reading stuff makes me really angry. I was like, this is a little more genuine. I'm feeling it. And she stopped and she said, I'm so sorry, but there is this man who keeps interrupting, and he's tall, fit, like soccer player fit, not like bodybuilder fit. He's flying around, flexing his muscles and laughing. And I'm so confused. And I was like, that sounds oddly familiar. And I was like, do you know his name? And she's like, he won't tell me his name because he told you to name him years ago, and you named him for a star. Keep in mind, I never told anyone, not even my grandmother, that. Nobody knew that. You named him for a star, and it's time for you to say his real name. And I was like, but I don't know his real name. And she's like, no, you do. And the moment she said that, Hermes popped out of my mouth. Like, it wasn't even my mind. It just came out of my mouth. And as she said that, there was a crash in the kitchen and a glass broke. Keep in mind, no one was in there. I heard my ex-husband run up the stairs. It was a glass that had been in a cabinet too. It wasn't just sitting out. And the cabinet was open, the glass is shattered. And I heard a laugh. And that's when I realized the two entities I had been seeing that I thought were angels for years were actually Hermes and Aries. And they had always kind of been around. And I realized then, like, some things would never be the same after that. And they weren't, because then suddenly I'm starting to connect with Hecate and Hades and all these other deities, to the point where I swear I work with almost every Hellenic god and goddess, as well as a couple others in some different pantheons that I've just connected with at various times, also with some of the Goetia. And it has been one of the most healing, positive things ever. From that moment forward, my life changed. I started getting rid of things that no longer served. I cut out so many people that I realized weren't healthy for me, including my own mother, which I'm actually writing an article about mourning living people. But I started healing the relationship I had with my body. I had some ED going on that I've really addressed. I started healing so many aspects of myself, like traumas that I thought I had healed, but I really hadn't. I started facing things differently. I started accepting things differently. I started centering myself instead of others and choosing myself. Again, more deconstruction of the Christian lens of things. I started doing such an overhaul that from 2019 to 2026, so I'm totally different. And people I've known my entire life have said this, that I'm entirely different. People, when on Facebook, sometimes it'll be like, here, compare your picture from 10 years ago to now. So many people are like, you look like you're aging backwards, number one, glamour magic for the win. But you just look happier. Your eyes are brighter, everything. I said, because I've accepted myself. I'm no longer afraid. I'm healing these parts of myself, which I will always be a work in progress. But I have accepted something in my life that is so much more active. When I manifest, I have action steps. When I work with my deities, there's homework to do. There's stuff I got to do. They will back me up, but I got to do the work. And one of the biggest examples is I work with one of the members of the Goetia, and we worked together a lot in the beginning when I first started getting into it, and then he kind of disappeared for a little bit. Which happens to me. Sometimes deities just they're like, all right, you don't need me right now. I'll see you later. And who knows when they'll come back. But at the end of last year, I started really feeling them when I was in a very dark place due to some medical things that were going on and other things. And I reached out to a reader that I admire greatly. And I said, I know you work with him too. Can you help me with this? I want insight. And he told me I needed to do a releasing spell on New Year's Eve and a call-in spell on New Year's Day, which I did. And actually on New Year's Day is when I had met my partner previously at a Halloween party, but he was seeing someone else. But that day we connected and he wasn't seeing anybody. And ever since then, my life has changed even more. I manifested 13 things in that ritual, and now 10 out of the 13 things have either come true or are an active coming true, like they are working on it. And it's very obvious. And it's the beginning of June. The Wheel of the Year reading that my friend does for me every year, a lot of that has matched so perfectly, it's honestly a little scary. And I have never felt more secure in my life despite taking a million leaps of faith this year, including this podcast. In fact, this podcast was one of the manifestations. I wasn't sure how it would be received until I started meeting other practitioners, including a few people who will be guests on here. And I told them my idea, and they were like, oh my God, we love it. I started the Instagram think it was like May 13th or something. And since that day, it's not even been a full month, we've been viewed 11,000 times. A- And I hadn't even put out an episode yet. I've been shared a bunch. I have a bunch of people interested in this idea. They're really excited. I don't know how it'll actually turn out, but I manifested this because I want anything I do as a creator, as a witch, to be giving space for things, to be giving back in some way, shape, or form, to be promoting things for other people in some way, shape, or form. That's what I'm meant to do. And I know that, especially from that reading from that particular deity, because he was like, this is what you're supposed to do. And I was like, yeah, that's kind of even in my chart. Time to do it, you know. But this year has been one of the best years of my life, even with the bad days and hard things that have come up. You know, the day I launched the Instagram, my aunt passed away. And that's when I knew I needed to launch it. And I'll tell you why. She had a really hard life. I didn't know her super, super well. Like, we had some really nice memories, and I got to spend some time with her, but she was kind of the black sheep of the family. And I didn't really get to spend a lot of time with her because of that. And when she passed, it really hit me. And my family told me that they had decided not to do any kind of funeral or memorial for her. And that just pissed me the fuck off. I was like, this woman had a hard enough life. We can't give her her fair time. So I reached out to some of my new death worker friends and some of the participants in that Hades book club that I still chatted with and said, listen, they're not giving her a memorial. If you have the space today, if you can light a candle or even just wish her good journey, I would appreciate it. And I had so many responses. These people didn't know her, but they took that time to honor a woman who never really got honored. And that's the day I knew I had to do this. Oh, I didn't expect to cry. I thought something else would make me cry, but it was the good-heartedness of this type of worker that really, I knew it was time to do this. And that was the day I worked on launching the Instagram and like started taking the steps. And ever since, it's like really snowballed a lot faster than I thought it would. And so I dedicate this episode to my Aunt Terry because, again, she had a hard life and no one really ever gave her much. But I hope she's happier where she is. Like, she deserves that. Um, and that's kind of my story and like how I came to be here. And I was always meant to work with death. I was always meant to work on this end of the spectrum. Again, I work with the light too, but I'm meant for this end. And I know a lot of my fellow practitioners feel the same way, that there is such a value in shadow work and healing and working with these beings because they're not afraid of your darkness. Why would they be? They're dark too. And they want you to not be afraid of your darkness. They want you to heal the parts that can be healed, honor the parts that need to be honored, and use the parts that you can for whatever it is you need to do to survive this crazy world and either make a difference or whatever that means for you. And I think that's why it's so valuable. And I think that's why it's so important to recognize the benefit of this end of the spectrum and like what it can mean, and what this community can do when we come together, because I think it's very important. Little disclaimer, I'm going to be talking a lot about a lot of religions. I have quite a deep background in that because, again, I'm a sociologist and I also studied under some of the top theologians because I'm fascinated by religion and its history. I have experienced many things. I've read many religious texts over the years. None of what I'm saying is to bash a religion. You're allowed to believe whatever you want as long as it doesn't hurt other people. That's always been what I've said. So my little disclaimer that will be pretty much at the end of every episode. This is not meant to bash you. This is meant to give space and have honest, fair discourse about this topic. And sometimes people have religious trauma like I did, and it led them to this, and that's why it's freeing. I value you as an individual, and I recognize your need for whatever faith you've chosen. If you're upset by the words we say, that is a wonderful time to take a step back and try to understand why that upsets you. This is actually a start to shadow work. Why did that upset you? Is it something deeper? And how can you analyze that? How can you work with it? What can that mean for you in your growth? Because we're all just humans trying to figure this crazy place out and get to a point. Ultimately, we've chosen this path. You've chosen yours. That's amazing. Who knows what the truth actually is? We don't know. We'll find out one day. And might be your truth, might be my truth, might be something so completely different that we're like, oh crap, nobody predicted that. Either way, we're just trying to live, and we're trying to come together and form a community and discuss what these things do for us. I wouldn't have my life any other way than right now. There's very little I would change, you know, because it makes me happy. And that's what I hope this podcast can do, is show the joy of those of us who do this work to promote themselves, because by goodness, we all need to promote ourselves in this economy, right? And to just have honest, open discourse about things. So thank you for sitting here and listening to me for the last half an hour. If you have questions about anything, you are always welcome to message me on any of our social media, but please be respectful. Anyone who is disrespectful or is just trying to do rage bait or anything like that, we're just going to block you. I don't have the energy or time for that. I'm not even going to respond. I don't care. But if you're wanting to ask honest questions, you're welcome to the table. That's what this is for. So, I hope you all have a wonderful week. Thank you all for listening. We will have our first guest. I'm recording actually tomorrow with her, with the Witch of Hemlock. I'm so excited. She is fantastic. I'm really interested to see where our conversation goes and how long we can actually talk about it. But I'm recording with her tomorrow, so hopefully that episode will drop within the next couple of weeks, since I'll be dropping this one here later this week. But keep an eye out for that. And if you're interested in being a guest, or if you know of someone who might be interested, please reach out to us. I'd be more than happy to chit chat with you and see if it's a good fit. I want to try to welcome anyone and everyone. I'm a big believer in I want different types of voices and everything else. The only thing we do not allow is racism, bigotry, homophobia, or being a TERF. We don't have time for that. This is an inclusive place, and we're just not going to go there. So if that is your personal belief that you're allowed to have that, but this is not the space for you. So thanks for listening. Have a good week, and I'll talk to you all soon.